iGlobe News brings global views.
iGlobe News would like to welcome our listeners to another edition of iGlobe News Pods. Please take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel and visit our website at www.iglobenews.org. Join the iGlobe News community by signing up to our newsletter. Joining me for today's interview is Brown University Emeritus Professor Catherine Lutz, co-founder and co-director of Brown University's Cost of War project at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Thank you, Professor Lutz, for coming on our show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Let me start by a brief introduction. You have a very impressive CV. You are a professor of anthropology. You chaired the Department of Anthropology at Brown University from 2009 to 2012 and have taught not only at Brown University, but at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the State University of New York at Binghamton, and Harvard University. You have received numerous honors, fellowships, and grants, including from the Carnegie Foundation, Open Society Foundation, and Cologne Foundation. You have held distinguished lectureships at numerous universities and societies and are a prolific writer of books and articles. Your research and teaching interests focus on war, the military, and society, democracy, as well as race, gender, automobility, inequality, cultural history, and U.S. 20th century history and ethnography, to name a few. You have published numerous books, including Homefront, A Military City and the American 20th Century, and your new book, War and Health, The Medical Consequences of the Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This provides a detailed look at how war affects human life and health far beyond the battlefield. In 2010, you initiated, together with Professor Netta Crawford of Boston University, the Cost of War project at Brown University, and you are currently its co-director. Welcome so much for being on the show. So let me start with a question regarding the Cost of War project. The Cost of War project has brought the hidden costs of the post-9/11 wars and counter-terror operations of the U.S. into the limelight. So what are some of these main costs?
Well, the very first cost is the loss of human life. We know that that's what wars always do. They kill human beings. And in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, the two main post 9/11 wars, there are nearly 1 million casualties, including civilians, soldiers, humanitarian workers, journalists. At the project, we tried to add up all of the categories of people who are often been not the attention hasn't been paid to all of the people who've died. We have a lot of attention in the U.S. press, at least, to soldiers who've died, U.S. soldiers. But again, that's really just a small fraction. 7,000 of that almost million individuals who died in those wars were U.S. soldiers. The rest were civilians in large part, and enemy combatants, other soldiers of other the other forces, both allied and opponent. And I think the direct death toll is just the most important part of the story. We also know that indirectly, which is to say, as a result of the war, but not as a result of bombs and bullets, there have been an additional several million people at minimum who've died. Again, this is the result of the war's disruption of people's livelihood, the numbers of refugees who've been created and living then under much more difficult circumstances for pregnancies for their children. And that death toll, additional death toll, is larger even than the number of people who died directly as a result of the fighting.
So that these are some shocking numbers, which of course the world has only learned about in such detail through the project that you've been heading now. So how does the U.S. rationalize such wars and the cost in human life, the destruction, and the financial expenditures? And Can we say, has the US achieved anything through these wars?
Well, to begin with the question of how the U.S. Justified its wars for the last 20 years, the objective of those wars, both wars, was theoretically to combat terrorism and to attack and eradicate the people who um, perpetrated 9/11 or might perpetrate future attacks in the U.S. itself. Um, there were many additional rationalizations that were given post fact, including liberating Afghan women, including regional stability, um, all of which, again, we can take each of those claims one by one for the war's rationale or efficacy. But those were the putative reasons. But again, um, one of the reasons why we know so little about the full death toll um, eh, from U.S. government sources is, of course, they're uninterested in really having that full picture before the American public. There has been, again, no public appetite um, for mass death, but as long as it's not really in front of people, it's really much easier for the war to continue. And of course, there are many people who felt the war had to continue, either for strategic reasons, which I think are misplaced, misbegotten, but also for economic reasons. There are people who profited from these wars for all of these years. All right. Well, let me just start with the question of the additional budgetary costs. The U.S. spent many trillions of dollars on these wars, and at the Cost of War Project, we each year looked very closely at the Pentagon budget and other categories of U.S. Spending, U.S. federal spending, to see what the war actually cost. And it was much more than just the Pentagon budget for the wars, what was called the Overseas Contingency Operation budget. The $8 trillion that we estimate was spent and obligated to be spent in these last 20 years is just a phenomenal sum, right? Our annual, it's basically almost 8 years of what our budget had been, a total budget for everything that the U.S. Congress determines needs spending each year in discretionary spending. That additional amount was the additional amount that we found was, again, not just in the Pentagon budget, but in the State Department budget, in the Department of Energy, in Department of Transportation. There are many places where there were additional war costs. But in addition, and most fundamentally, the costs come in the Veterans Administration, in medical care for injured soldiers, and this is again injuries that in some cases lead to lifelong disability. And so we projected out, our economist who looks at veterans' medical and disability payments, projected out for the lifetimes of those injured U.S. service members that an additional $1 trillion would be obligated to be spent on that. Interest on the debt, or this is all war spending on a credit card. That additional money for interest is another $1 trillion, so slightly more than $1 trillion. So again, once you put trillion plus a trillion plus a trillion, you end up again with this 8 trillion. In addition, the Pentagon budget, the base, what they call the base budget, increased radically during this period. And again, the Pentagon budget has tended to go up every year in any event, but in the last 20 years, it increased at a rate much higher than normal, which is as a result, we believe, of the war climate that was created after 9/11, and that continued to justify not just spending on those two wars, but spending more generally on battleships and again things that had little to do with the fight against terrorism. So I think we have to understand the ways in which these wars have reshaped the American spending priorities and have resulted in an even larger share of the federal discretionary budget each year going to the Pentagon and going to um, military factors like nuclear weapons, like care for veterans. Um, again, at this point, we have a federal discretionary budget that is over two-thirds military based. Everything else gets squeezed into that small part of the pie chart that's left. Again, transportation, Food and Drug Administration, education, and so on. So all the other human needs have been squeezed out over these last 20 years to an even greater extent than they had been before 2001.
So it makes actually no difference who's in control of the White House, if it's the Republicans or the Democrats. It seems to be a trend in the same direction. Would that be a statement that you would support?
Yes, absolutely. And General then President Eisenhower in the 50s uh, first noted this incredible um, transpartisan agreement to shift a huge amount of money from domestic spending into military spending and to expand the federal government in general in order to support a giant military industrial establishment. So these last 20 years of war have thrown gasoline on that fire that has been raging since World War II, and the making of the United States into a kind of warfare state. Um, Again, is something that many people have noticed, but particularly at the beginning of the process, back in the 1950s, people could see how different the United States and its federal priorities, its federal spending priorities were becoming in the last 20 years, though, again, we've increasingly spent money on contractors who do the work that soldiers used to do or that didn't get done because it wasn't considered crucial to Americans' welfare. So, over the last 20 years, our economists estimate that $14 trillion dollars has gone to contractors since the start of the war in Afghanistan in 2001. Again, a phenomenal sum going to companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, again, not just for arms manufacturing, but for various kinds of administrative and other tasks. And again, huge profits. These are companies that you watch their fate on the stock market from 9/11 forward, and they've always been healthy in their profit taking, but has definitely they've benefited tremendously from the last 20 years of war.
So why did it actually take two professors to start such an important project? And why have the media and investigative journalists not asked such important questions before you started it?
Well, I think that's a very good question. Many people have asked, how journalism um, succeeds and how it fails. One of the things that we know is that official press releases from the Pentagon get taken much more seriously than they ought to. We've just seen a couple of stories in the last week or so on the Pentagon's hiding of some very important and basic facts about their behavior in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think we 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 know that the national security language, the national security assumptions that have grown up over many years suggest that it's unpatriotic to ask questions of the Pentagon. You can ask questions of the Department of the Transportation, but to ask and question um, the the Pentagon is considered either more dangerous or more inappropriate. And again, the respect that the military has garnered, partly as a result of having such great uh, funding support from Congress, the respect that they've garnered from the American people over all these years through the power of their size, their public relations, the, folks who they have tremendous amount of financial support from that same congressional funding, all of the recruitment ads, the NFL. You can't watch a football game today without seeing flyovers and patriotic displays of from military veterans or active duty. So I think there's just a real strong cultural climate that makes journalists less interested in questioning or less able to question some of the basic assumptions that we have, that wars are always justified, they're always fought smartly and cleanly, that few civilians die, that they're going to be short when we're told they're going to be short, and if they go on longer than we thought, has nothing to do with decisions made in the Pentagon or in Washington. So I think there's a lot of reasons why we had to step into the breach in a sense.
So would it be safe to say that the mainstream media has also played a role in this militarization of society, which has been happening?
Yes, although I think there are some reporters who have, at great risk to themselves, for example, gone to Iraq and Afghanistan and tried to report from there. Increasingly, the military, of course, has controlled their activities and made it much more difficult for reporters to go to the field and see who is dying and how the war is being fought. To report on the lives of civilians caught in these conflicts, um, by embedding them, by requiring that they be embedded, by not allowing people to simply go and report. So I think some of this has to be laid at the foot of the Pentagon, which has tried since Vietnam to make sure that this kinds of images that seared the American public's understanding back in the 60s and 70s will not occur again. In other words, they understood that journalists made their job more difficult in a certain way because they reported that civilians were dying, that the war was not going well, that there was corruption in the Allied forces that we were working with in Vietnam. So to avoid that same situation in future conflicts, they worked much harder to rein in any kind of independent journalism in the war zones, at least.
But it's almost impossible now when every individual with a cell phone can tape something probably in a better quality than they did back in the 60s and 70s. So in fact, every person has become a online journalist, and if
Yeah.
he's there, he can tape it and put it online. So it would seem like things like this might be futile because you can't really stop anyone from taping it. There'll always be someone in some corner or in a window looking down, taping it,
Right.
who will
Right.
maybe tell the true story, which is not being told anywhere else.
Although there you also have the problem that if people are not taken seriously, if these sources, even with video um, evidence, are not taken as seriously as, say, a journalist for CBS News or The Intercept, right? That the whole question of using the power of the media, of the American media, to address an American audience about what's going on in their name in Afghanistan or Iraq or the Philippines or Africa right now. I mean, that's still extremely important to understand where the U.S. media is and
Yeah.
do everything we can to make sure everybody's on the job. But the university is a very important place for the production of knowledge. So um, I don't feel it's necessarily that the job has been left to us, but that some of the detailed understanding, which could come from Washington offices, of course, you're right, could come from the Congressional Budget Office, it could come from the Pentagon itself, keeping track of civilian deaths when they're right there, right, and causing some of them. So I think that that there still is an important place for government um, information gathering and public dissemination of that information particularly when these are very wars that have been catastrophic for again over several million people, and when so many trillions of dollars of American taxpayer money has gone to those wars. The American public deserves to know what's being done in a way that makes them uh, holds them responsible. Right? They should know what's being done in their name.
And your project certainly has gone a long way to informing the American public by just putting it out there for anyone who can click on your site can get the information. September 11th of this year marked the 20 years anniversary, sad anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. In your opinion, will such interventions, both overt and covert, by the U.S. as a response to 9/11 continue?
Yes, unfortunately, I was discouraged listening to the media coverage in the U.S. of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was spoken of as the end of the war, uh, and of course, it was the end of the U.S. direct involvement, boots on the ground in Afghanistan. But it was not the end of the global war on terror. Even though that the name has been changed in the halls of the Pentagon of that war, it very much continues in Africa, in the southern Philippines, in again around the world. The Cost of War Project has a map on its site that shows all of the places where the U.S. military has been engaged, either through training or actual combat or hostilities or um, unmanned drone attacks and so on. All of the places where that's occurring still today. So the war is definitely not over. I also think it's a misnomer to say that the war is over when so many people continue to be displaced from their homes. There are over 37 million refugees created by these wars. Some of them have returned home, but many have not. Um, the the people who were injured in that war outnumber those who died. Some of them, again, like we know with U.S. soldiers, because of media coverage, have devastating injuries. Again, many civilians, many hundreds of thousands of civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan are going to live for the next many decades with these devastating injuries. So the war's not over for them. It's not over for people who lost family members. There's just war's long-term impact is has often been far underestimated. We know that, for example, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs is still paying to take care of the some of the dependents of service members who fought in World War One. Right, hard as that might be to believe. Go to the Veterans Affairs website and you'll see their calculations of this now dwindling number of people who are still getting some support to deal with the effects of the war for the service members who fought there. And certainly World War II, as those numbers dwindle, there's still again significant numbers of dollars and medical care and other things that have to go out to those folks. So wars don't end when they're said to end.
Yeah, when I was researching for our interview, I heard another interview that you have on your website, in which you stated that the war doesn't end just when you take your troops out, and that certainly is the case. And another figure which stuck in my head is that now that the Cost of War Project is estimating that 38 million people have been displaced, and this is the same amount which was displaced during World War II. So we're talking about a phenomenal number of people who are really affected and will be affected for generations to come. So I think it's not an understatement if we say that America in the 20th century has turned into a military empire. What are the reasons for this development, and is there any way this militarization can be stopped?
Okay. Well, I think when you say we're a military empire, I think you may be referring in part to the fact that we have 800 military bases outside the United States. Those 800 military bases are forward deployed in every corner of the earth. Many of them are the result of previous wars. So we have tremendous numbers of bases that we kept in Germany after World War II, in Italy, in Korea, not in Vietnam because again we were ejected from that country. But I think we have an investment as a country in maintaining the sense that we should be in control of events around the world at every point, at every corner. So I think that that sense that we are, we ought to, again, be in control, have power to do anything, anywhere, at any time, right? It's not portrayed necessarily like that. It's portrayed as, providing security benefits to other regions. It's portrayed as protecting the United States by fighting people, being prepared to fight people out at some distance from the United States before they get to the United States. So there's all sorts of rationales that are given for it, but it's unprecedented in human history. It's arguably not only unnecessary but counterproductive to our security, and it's certainly more expensive than people realize in terms of what the trade-offs are, what the opportunity costs are for those dollars in terms of security at home from things like the effects of climate change, from people being terrorized by, we can say, people being terrorized by natural disasters that result from climate change, right? So all of the ways we might have protected ourselves, protected our population from poverty or ill health um, uh, or these sorts of effects of climate change, all of that could have been a different priority for those dollars might have been set. But so the question of why do we have this giant expansive international military base network? Why are we building new bases today on Guam and throughout the Mariana Islands uh, at the expense of the people of Guam, right, who are dealing with having, again, thousands of Marines about to descend on their island, having whole swaths of the island cleared for further base building, having toxic sites since World War II that have not been cleaned up, that have polluted their water supply. So there's just a really um, um, fairly horrific story that needs to be told about what the United States military deployment over the globe has done over these last many years since World War II. Right? And I think, asking why, you have to ask about these corporations. There's a carry-on imperative, it can be called, that is directed by those corporations. There's a couple of very important myths that this is that help support it, including the idea that it's much less expensive than it is, including the idea that it creates jobs, right? That we have this large military budget, but people all across the country benefit from it through the jobs that it creates. Our own research shows, and the research of a number of economists shows, that the number of jobs created by Pentagon spending is far inferior to the number of jobs which would have been created by the same amount of spending on domestic needs like healthcare, education, um, uh, climate mitigation. And that's because those jobs created in health or education are much more labor intensive, are much more domestic in their content than Pentagon spending. So that rationale does not work. If you want to create jobs, and again, even more importantly, if you want to create jobs, you might not want to do it um, through the creation of a war culture, war economy. You might want to do it through things that have more constructive and long term beneficial effects on society and societies around the world.
For sure. And I think that the contribution of the Cost of War Project in providing real information has been huge in this area. As you've already mentioned a couple of times, you also show the power and the influence of what has come to be known as the military-industrial complex. The militarization of society permeates all aspects of civil society, including intensified militarization of the police, for instance, or transfer of equipment from the military to the police, or also human transfer, like veterans who then move from the military to the police. The MIC has spent billions of dollars to lobby their cause. So what is the role that the MIC plays and their lobbyists in the militarization of the U.S. And also, one interesting fact that I saw on your website is that of the $700 billion which goes to the Pentagon, half, more or less, a little bit less than half, 300, actually go to external contractors. So they are private companies. So in effect, you have like a war business going. Which is how kind of you labeled it on the website itself, which I thought was really scary. So people making money actually from fighting wars. So maybe you could explain to our viewers what role and the power of the military industrial complex plays in current US society.
Well, if you walk through the halls of Congress, the people that you will see meeting with Congress people, meeting with their staff, um, pleading their case, arguing their case for particular arms programs or um, uh, support services for the military. Those people are in the thousands, in a sense, crawling all over Capitol Hill, making their case and making campaign contributions to those same Congress people. Um, who's not in the halls of Congress are civilians in the war zones, talking about uh, what those wars that these contracts to the corporations, what those wars actually produce on the ground, um, both in terms of these kinds of death and disruption and dislocation, but in terms of the kinds of local political views of the United States, right? This is not the United States is has suffered a tremendous reputational hit as well. In other words, so there's not the people who are in the offices of Congress people um, um, being able to influence the allocation of U.S. funds are these corporations. They have literally legions of lobbyists who are there and have tremendous influence.
So, as you said, those that don't have a voice maybe should have a voice, and the others have maybe too much of a voice. And then the outcome is what we see unfolding in front of us. So, how can your project, your Cost of War project, foster democracy and help decision makers make more informed decisions by maybe taking the other side into consideration as well? And another question in this line is, have you received any governmental reactions to your project?
Well, in terms of reactions to our project, well, yes, the Pentagon has occasionally responded to our reports, and but mostly they try to pretend we didn't do the research that we did. Um, but we were very gratified to see that President Biden talked about our project and our estimate of the cost of this war when he announced the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan as one of the reasons for withdrawing. Right, that we just could not sustain the cost. Right. I wish he had also mentioned the number of people who have died. That the people of Afghanistan could not sustain the cost as well. So I think that's been great to see, and we've had numbers of people in Congress use our data on the House floor, on the Senate floor, in talking about particular pieces of legislation, like trying to rescind the authorization for the use of military force passed in the panic right after 9/11, but used then to justify U.S. troops in everywhere um, from Mali to the Mindanao to Afghanistan and Iraq. So we know that our data can be used by people in Congress and also by activists who are trying to again um, assert that foreign policy should also be a matter of democratic deliberation. That we should have the information. That we should have a public discussion rather than a salute and a march as when the Pentagon tells us, the civilian leadership of the Pentagon tells us that we're going to war, right? That we should say why, when, how, and what are the alternatives. And we know there are so many alternatives to war as an instrument of foreign policy. The State Department budget has shrunk tremendously over the last 20 years. Yes, our information about the costs, the human costs and the budgetary costs, has been used by members of Congress, in both the House and the Senate, in floor debate, for example, on the varieties of issues that they have to take up. For example, the attempt to repeal the authorization for the use of military force, the AUMF, and which has justified the wars in not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, but has been used to cover and justify war activities all around the world, in West Africa, in East Africa, in Mindanao, in many places around the world. So I think we're gratified to see that the research can be used by those who want to make social change in the frequency with which the United States goes to war and the way in which it does. So I think that's a really important aspect of what we're trying to do, is have that research get used in the attempt to make foreign policy more democratic, which is to say, something that's decided by the people with full information, um, and by the people's representatives representing um, their sense of what we want to be doing as a nation around the world. One of the things that many Americans will agree with is that it's important to use diplomacy. And the State Department budget has shrunk tremendously in the last 20 years as the Pentagon budget has grown. And I think a more democratic foreign policy would be one, particularly with an informed public, in which that trend would be reversed.
I think that's a very important statement, and also shows that the contribution that your project is making to make decisions more democratic is very vital. You have a book, a very latest book of your long line of books, which you have written and co-authored. This one is called War and Health: The Medical Consequences of the Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's a critical examination of the indirect casualties, examining health outcomes not only on the battlefield, but also in hospitals, homes, and refugee camps, both during and after hostilities. Your book was published in 2019. The failure of the US 20-year engagement in Afghanistan and the chaotic US withdrawal at the end of August 2021 confirms your thesis that the US goes to war without understanding the catastrophic effects it has on entire ecosystems of human health. The US war and sanctions policy in Iraq is another such failure. Has the US learned anything from Afghanistan and Iraq? And is there any hope that such engagements will end? What will it take?
Wow. That's a difficult question. What will it take? It will take, I think, the kind of crisis that you would think the pandemic had created, in which um, the U.S. Congress might step back and say, "Look, we've just lost 800,000 people, almost 800,000 people to this virus. How did that happen? How could we have prevented it? How could we have mitigated it when it occurred? Um, what kinds of resources could have been invested ahead of time in pandemic prevention, and in the general health of the population? Our most vulnerable are those who died in this pandemic. People whose health was compromised, sometimes for lack of medical care, often for lack of adequate medical care. We don't have universal health care in the United States. We do have the most behemoth military the world has ever seen. Um, and I think that crisis would have hopefully begun to sink in as a reminder that our priorities are misplaced, and that a militarized society is not a healthy society, is not a secure society. That the real threats to human well-being and security in the United States are not foreign terrorists, They're white supremacists, as our own FBI has pointed out, are indigenous domestic white supremacist terrorists. But even there, the threat is to that the thing that's most likely to kill people is poor health care. Are these climate catastrophes that we need to invest tremendous amount of money and effort into to dealing with? So I think those redefining national security will hopefully be in part a result of seeing the failures of a militarized national security policy in Iraq and Afghanistan, and seeing the failure of our domestic priorities to put human well-being at the front of attention and support through congressional appropriations and priorities.
Because it's something you mentioned before, if all this money, or at least a good portion of it, which had been invested in these wars, maybe would have been invested in infrastructure, in hospitals, etc., probably couldn't have prevented the pandemic because it's a worldwide catastrophe at the moment, but maybe you could have mitigated the awful results and the suffering as a result of the situations which developed on the ground. What
And on that, let me just also add, I think, the media can play a role in questioning some of these frames that have been handed to us by interested parties in Congress, in particular, in this case. So, just these recent debates about domestic spending, the idea of spending $1 trillion over 10 years, not this year, but over 10 years, on infrastructure, on all of those most basic and expensive pieces of our that hold together our economy, our roads, our broadband, our all of that. The media has reported on that $1 trillion or that $2 trillion, depending on which part of the packages one's talking about, as this most phenomenal number, right? Well, again, in the context of 8 trillion spent over 20 years for these two failed wars, I mean, it really should be set in context. The number only makes sense to people compared to what, right?
Yeah.
And again, $1 trillion over 10 years is $100 billion per year, right? That's 1/7 of the Pentagon budget is $100 trillion. 1/7, 1/8, again, just the Pentagon, not to include the Department of Energy, where nuclear weapons are being rebuilt at great expense. Not to include the Veterans Affairs, where we have, again, that's the second largest department of in the federal government in terms of the expense of running it after the Pentagon. So if you put all of that together, again, the $1 trillion over 10 years is just 1 year's budget for the Pentagon and its associated departments.
So it relativizes everything if one looks at a bigger picture, which I think is a very important result of your project, of the Cost of War project, because it really helps you to get a better understanding of the entire picture, and not only focusing, as you said, just on like one little slice of the pie when 90% of the pie isn't actually discussed in the open. So what can be done by civil society, by anyone who would like to spread the important results of the Cost of War project? Is there anything else each individual should do who wants to support this project?
Oh, absolutely. I think, sharing the information, sharing the website. I think we started a teaching initiative where, particularly for college classes, but I think in high school as well. This is something that could be incorporated into education about American history, about American civics, about U.S. history. So I think there's a lot of ways in which the information that's on our website under our teaching resources could be used by people in not just teachers, but people who are trying to educate themselves about the kinds of issues that their own representatives might hear from them about in the voting booth or in between elections. So I think those are things that we can all become better informed about and talk about with our friends and neighbors and family.
So one should just spread the word and keep the discussion going as such.
Mhm.
what areas will the cost of war project focus on moving forward?
Well, we realize that the war on terror continues. We're going to continue to do research on those questions of where U.S. military forces and investments are going in the name of the war on terror. But we're also increasingly trying to understand the after effects of war in terms of things like indirect death that's ongoing because of the destruction of infrastructure, particularly in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, or destroyed economy that has resulted from the war. Um, then there are ongoing health and economic effects for in the war zones that we want to continue to do research on and bring attention to. And the new Cold War, the idea that the United States uh, should see China as an enemy and be investing a tremendous amount into military resources in places like Guam and in building out an even larger navy. Um, I think those we want to draw attention to and do research on those um, the costs of that new Cold War as well.
Of course, you always need an enemy for investitures in the military. So you always have to find a good enemy to justify increases in budget. So I also hope that this new Cold War won't turn out to be a new Cold War, and that this discussion maybe that President Biden had with President Xi will move forward and maybe avert a new Cold War, which many are forecasting. At the moment, U.S. society is deeply divided internally. Have you received any negative feedback or threats from those opposed to the work you are doing? And has your website ever been hacked?
No, I think we began our project 10 years ago, 11 years ago. At that point, the wars had already been ongoing for 10 years, and I think a lot of people in the United States had become disillusioned with those wars. So I think people, again, were not quite as um, agitated and upset and anxious and in some cases angry as they were right after 9/11. Um, and I think that to us was actually very gratifying to see that we were reflecting a need for information that was out there in the public, which was saying, why are we still there? What's happening? Why are these wars going so poorly, and why are they continuing? Um, in this very polarized environment, it is hard to question military spending. But I think, yeah, we have a quite dysfunctional Congress, except unfortunately when it comes to military spending. There's still a fear that politicians have to cross the line that says that you're weak on defense, right? That if you don't vote for larger budgets every year for the Pentagon, despite its failures in the wars that it's been prosecuting, despite the other priorities that we have as a nation for our own security in terms of health and climate change and so on, you still risk um, uh, again stepping into a political minefield in which your opponent can accuse you of being soft on defense. And again, that's a part of American politics that's really dysfunctional.
So if you
Defense from what, right? Who's defending us from climate change? Who's defending us from poor health care? Who's defending us from underinvestment in communities of color and their educational systems, right? Uh, Not that people should be. It should be the case that increasingly our politicians have to worry about being seen as weak on public defense in terms of those needs for well-being.
which probably also is a reflection of the amount which is spent on lobbying from those sections. So in effect, your project is lobbying for the other side without the billions of billions of going into it. You are the voice of those who are unheard, And so if you had a message, I mean, your project is quoted all over the world, politicians, academics, peace activists. What message would you have for them?
Well, thank you for everything you do. When you try to draw attention to the costs of war, when you try and draw attention to the civilians in these war zones who, through absolutely no fault of their own, are tossed out of their homes, have their water systems and sewage systems bombed, and live with the kind of terror of drone warfare. I mean, when you draw attention to those things, again, you do the work that those people can't do in many cases themselves. So I'm really grateful for anybody who's working in those veins.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lutz, for sharing all this really important information and your insights and your knowledge with our audience out there. It was really great that you came on our show and talked to our listeners. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. I really appreciate your questions and in this forum.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Sure.